All right, everyone, welcome back. So we're ready for our fourth and last panel of the day. And so I would like to introduce our moderator, just for the name of the panel. So it's Regulatory Pathways and Pitfalls for Alt Protein. And our moderator will be Dr. David Stone. He's a professor in food science and technology at Oregon State University. He directs the Food Innovation Center, an agricultural experiment station in downtown Portland, with the mission to support food and beverage companies across the Pacific Northwest and beyond. So his expertise is in emerging food technologies, food safety, and risk analysis. Dave?
Thank you, George, for the introduction. And I want to thank everyone in the faculty and the staff at Lewis and Clark, and also my fellow panelists for this event. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. As George mentioned, we're going to be talking about the regulatory pathways and pitfalls for this 90-minute session. And a quick little outline of how we'll do this today. I will give a little brief intro into what we see at the Food Innovation Center with entrepreneurs and some upcoming market trends in the alternative protein space. I'll introduce all of the three panelists that I'm really excited to introduce today, and then each one of them will give a 10 to 15 minute overview of their topic. Concluding that, we'll go into a discussion among the panelists. And then during this time, I'll monitor your questions from the audience that you might have for them. And so everyone should be familiar by now with the Q&A button on the bottom. If you wouldn't mind registering your questions through there that you might have for all of the panel or any panel individual, I'll make sure to look at that throughout the event today. So I really am excited to introduce all three of the panelists at this point. And let me start in order that they'll be presenting following my brief introduction. The first is Laura Braden. Laura is a lead regulatory counsel at the Good Food Institute, where she focuses on United States and international regulatory issues affecting plant-based and cultivated meat issues, and oversees GFI's litigation work. Before joining the Good Food Institute, Mrs. Braden worked in private practice as a litigator and regulatory attorney and as an appellate attorney at the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs. She earned her BA from Princeton University and her JD from Harvard Law School. I think I've heard of both of those, and received a master's degree in anthropology from New York University. She's admitted to the bar in Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. Following Laura's presentation, we'll hear from George Kimbrell. He's a legal director for the Center for Food Safety, a nationwide nonprofit with a mission to empower people, support farmers, and protect the planet from the harmful impacts of industrial agriculture. His legal, legislative, and policy work runs a gamut of CFS programs, including animal agriculture, crop agriculture, food labeling, food safety, and, as most relevant here, new and emerging food technologies. Among other landmark cases, George was counsel in the first U.S. Supreme Court case on genetically engineered organism regulation. Before joining CFS, George completed a clerkship with the Honorable Ronald M. Gould, U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. He received his law degree from Lewis and Clark Law School, where since 2010, he has been an adjunct professor for the class Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Law. George, I'd love to sit in on that. And then finally, we have Mathilde Cohen, as she is the George Williamson Crawford Professor at the University of Connecticut Law School. She works in the fields of construction law, health law, comparative law, food law, and race and gender law. Her research centers on the foundational questions related to bodies, nourishment, and reproduction. And I think you're going to be really interested in the topic that she's chosen for today. So with that, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to share my screen to give a brief overview of many of the issues or the things that we see among entrepreneurs. So if I could get a thumbs up from one of the panelists that you're seeing a slide that says sustainable protein, regulatory pathways, and pitfalls. Thank you, George. At the Food Innovation Center, really quickly, we're an agricultural experiment station associated with OSU, which is a land-grant university for the state of Oregon. And at this center, we work with a lot of food entrepreneurs, and the plant-based space in particular, but also the cell or cultured meat space is one that is clearly growing in the minds of our entrepreneurs because they see a clear demand among their consumers. So what do our consumers and our entrepreneurs want? They want the so-called clean label, so minimal ingredients, ingredients that are familiar to people. They want minimally processed. The health and wellness space is emerged as a huge space. They want all natural. They want something that's sustainable, and they want authentic. And in a lot of ways, this in its totality is quite disruptive, particularly for a very large pre-existing food companies. We're seeing a huge rising demand for plant-based protein in general. It's estimated that by 2025, you'll be at a $40 billion US dollar mark for this space. That's probably undercounting, I think. And really, we're seeing innovation across the board at the point of it's plant-based everything. I tried my first plant-based tuna not too long ago. That would have sounded like science fiction to me 10 years ago. Obviously, I think folks are familiar with the plant-based dairy, plant-based meat sectors, but really we're going to a possibility of anything can be plant-based. And I'd like to just really emphasize that, we're familiar with the traditional value add chain, right? Of a dairy cattle becoming cheese or ice cream, hops becoming beer, oats or wheat going into cereal and different products. But the new value chain is one that's going to require a lot of outreach, a lot of regulation, and just, the ultimate consumer acceptance, right? To have a sustainable, profitable market. And so these bioreactors are going to be the value add chain of the future for many sectors. And it's going to have a lot of ramification for society, particularly rural societies. I'll conclude with a couple of trends that are there in the marketplace. I think you've probably heard several of them already today, but the idea of transparency throughout the supply chain is only going to grow where people continue to have concerns, and we see the realities of climate change, water scarcity, loss of biodiversity, much of that attributed to the traditional way that we're doing agriculture. So people are demanding something different. I think at the end of the day, a lot of consumers are going to be flexitarians. So even if they're unfamiliar with the technology, like a cell-based meat, if the ultimate endpoint could be more sustainability, I think we're going to see people adopting those unfamiliar technologies. And of course, having trust in a regulatory framework around that is going to be key. Another big market trend that we see both in traditional cuisine, but also I think what we'll see in plant-based is the growth in global cuisine and traditional authentic cuisines. And so being able to combine regional flavors and spices with plant or cell-based formats really leads to endless possibilities. But if you take that upstream and downstream, will there be regulatory backlash from countries that do benefit from labels and authenticity in traditional ways? Champagne and bourbon come to mind. Will this result in trade barriers, or will it accelerate trade among countries that adopt similar frameworks? And so a lot of regulatory questions to answer just on that global piece of this issue. And one of our speakers will be talking on international frameworks. Also thinking about where plant-based and cell-based and alternative proteins in general can go throughout the human lifespan. Right now, there are several products in development that are targeting certain demographics. And so these flexitarian parents I mentioned, they'll be marketed to about products that remind them of their childhood, that feature familiar flavors and colors, in hopes that they'll be adopting them for their own kids in the next generation. And so ultimately, these new protein sources will span consumer life from infant formula all the way through elderly nutritional supplements. And are our regulatory structures robust enough to transfer over here, or do they need to be tweaked for those different lifespans and demographics? And then finally, value, and to me, starts with safety, and no food system is free from risk. And so how will FDA and USDA address the emerging issues posed by these new technologies or processes that overlap between traditional and alternative proteins? When you think about the way inspections are done, enforcement, outreach and education to growers and processors, there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done as we look at these issues. And I believe you'll hear from the panelists on how the USDA and FDA are starting to parse that out. So with that, I'll turn it over to I'll stop sharing my screen and turn it over to our first panelist, Laura.
Thank you so much, David. And I'm very excited to be here. I'm going to be talking about sort of a global perspective, as David mentioned, on regulatory frameworks existing now in different countries and how they're planning to accommodate cultivated meat in particular. So let me share my screen here. All right, sorry, there we go. Hopefully you're seeing my slides now. Are we? No. Did I share my screen? No. Sorry about that. Let me try one more time. All right, is that working now? Thank you.
Looks great.
Great. Sorry. So as I said, I'm going to be doing sort of an overview of regulatory frameworks from a global perspective, and I will be talking about what the US is doing as well in terms of FDA and USDA and how they're sharing responsibility for cultivated meat. Let me start off though by just introducing my organization for people who might not be familiar with it. I'm the lead regulatory counsel at the Good Food Institute, or GFI, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that works to create a sustainable, secure, and just food system by promoting alternative proteins. So cultivated meat is one area of focus for us, but we are broader than that, and we do focus on the decline of plant-based products that David was just talking about, as well as products developed with precision fermentation ingredients. We have 3 primary programmatic groups that focus on this issue in different ways. Our science and technology group, which focuses on helping to advance scientific breakthroughs that enable alternative proteins to succeed, doing this by identifying key knowledge gaps and allocating grant funding towards high impact research projects, as well as helping to grow the scientific community that is focused on these issues. Our corporate engagement department focuses on helping the food industry and the investor communities put alternative proteins on the menu by partnering with companies throughout the supply chain to identify impactful business activities that will help advance alternative proteins to compete with conventional products on the key drivers of consumer success, taste, price, and convenience. And then the policy team, which is my team, works both on advocating for government funding, especially for open access research and development, and also advocating for fair regulation and legislation. So I wanted to give a quick overview of what cultivated meat is and a general sense of how it's made. By cultivated meat, what I'm referring to, which can also be referred to by different names, and I think we'll be talking a little bit more about that. Cell-based, cultured, and cell-cultured meat are some of the names that different countries that I'll be talking about refer to it as. So you may hear me use any of those terms. At GFI, we use cultivated meat, and it refers to meat grown from animal cells, but outside of the body of the animal. So this type of meat is not on the market, as I'm sure most of you know, here in the United States, but there are a number of companies working on developing it. And one of those companies has received regulatory approval in Singapore and sold its products there in small quantities so far. So here, this is a generalized, sort of simplified overview of the manufacturing process, which begins with obtaining a small sample of cells from an animal. And the cells are then sorted. And the manner of doing that will depend on the sample type, which could be a biopsy or a biological sample like a blood draw. In some cases, the cells may be reprogrammed to develop a cell line. In some cases not, that won't occur. But once a cell line is established, the next step is cell banking, which is expanding the cells in a culture and forming a master cell bank. This will be, and this is a process that is used in other animal cell biomanufacturing industries. The next stage is here as phase 1 cell proliferation. That's where a vial from the cell bank will be pulled and the cells will be added to a larger vessel, a bioreactor with a cell culture media that provides nutrients to cause the cells to proliferate. And then at the next stage, the tissue perfusion stage, there is a change in the culture conditions that will push the cells to differentiate into muscle, fat, and connective tissue. This stage typically will involve scaffolding, which provides a structural support system. Scaffolding can be made from a variety of food-safe, non-animal edible materials, such as vegetable, protein, or cellulose. And then the next stage, which is not actually pictured on this slide, but is harvesting the cells and then processing them and packaging them in ways that will probably look similar to what occurs with conventional meats. So Singapore, as I mentioned, is the only country so far that has approved regulatorily a sale of cultivated meat, in this case, poultry. And it has done that under a novel food framework. So Eat Just is the company that had cultivated a chicken product approved by the Singapore Food Agency in December 2020. That product has subsequently been sold in a restaurant in Singapore and through a home delivery partnership with another restaurant in fairly limited quantities. Singapore approved the product through a novel food assessment process, and most countries that I'm going to be talking about use a novel food process for addressing cultivated meat. Novel foods are defined somewhat differently in different countries. In Singapore, they are foods that don't have a history of safe use, which Singapore defines as being consumed as an ongoing part of a diet by a significant human population for at least 20 years without reported adverse human health effects. So the guidelines, Singapore issued guidelines for its assessment process, first in late 2019, that were kind of fairly sparse. But just at the end of last year, the agency released updated guidelines that are more robust and provide more details about the types of information companies will be required to provide as part of the pre-market approval process. And it includes sections on safety assessment criteria for specific types of novel foods, including cultured meat. So for example, companies will have to provide information on all of the inputs to the various stages that we were looking at the previous slide, information on the processing steps that are taken to ensure that the cell lines and culture media are free from infectious agents throughout the production process, as well as other information. A number of other countries have indicated that they will be considering applications for cultivated meat under their novel food regulations that currently exist. Canada is one of them. It classifies cultivated meat and seafood as a novel food that requires submission through its 3-part approval process. The first step is a novel food notification that goes to Health Canada. There's also a separate process to obtain a new substance notification approval. And in Canada, cultivated meat will also need to obtain an animal feed approval, even if it's not intended as animal feed, because of possible supply chain crossover. In the European Union, the novel food regulation that the European Union uses explicitly covers cultivated meat. Although if genetic engineering is used in creating the product, then EU's regulation on genetically modified food and feed might apply instead. The European Food Safety Authority, or EFSA, will conduct a risk assessment and give a scientific opinion on the safety and nutritional aspects of the product. And if the assessment is positive, then there's another step in the EU where final approval is with the European Commission and representatives from all of the member states. EFSA has also published guidance on preparation of the novel foods application, including some specifically applicable guidance for cultured meat. The UK post-Brexit has its own system and a different agency, of course, but it's fairly similar on a technical level to the EU's system. The political process is a little different because their decisions will be made by the UK government ministers of each constituent country. In Australia and New Zealand, the novel food regulation there, the regulator has determined that it implicitly covers cultivated meat, though it's not explicitly mentioned in the regulation. Australia and New Zealand have a shared food regulatory system. And then the last two countries that I'm going to mention other than the US are one, Israel, where cultivated meat is considered to be a new food that will be evaluated under the Health Ministry's National Food Services new food registration process. I think Israel is a country to watch in terms of a forthcoming approval because its government has been fairly enthusiastic about cultivated meat, with Prime Minister Netanyahu at the end of December 2020 being the first head of state to try cultivated meat, and also announcing at that time that the government would be appointing a regulatory body to coordinate policy for alternative proteins. Japan is an interesting example because its existing regulatory regime could theoretically accommodate cultivated meat without pre-market approval, but the Japanese government is working on developing a specific regulatory framework to properly shape the market. So one way it's doing that is through a government initiative that launched a collaboration between industry, academia, and government to create formalized guidance for cultivated meat within the regulatory framework. And the government has also established this food tech research group that involves many companies spanning multiple new food technologies, not just cultivated meat. So turning to the United States, the system here is a little bit different from the frameworks I've discussed in other countries, primarily because, or at least in part because, for products that are derived from cells of poultry and livestock, animals that fall under the jurisdiction of the US Department of Agriculture, there will be those products will be subject to joint regulation by both FDA and USDA. This was determined in March of 2019 when the two agencies entered into a formal agreement outlining how they were going to govern those products. So just to clarify, for most cultivated fish products, for example, those will fall entirely under FDA's jurisdiction for all steps of the process, including labeling and harvesting. But for the poultry and livestock derived products, there's going to be a combined regulatory structure where FDA will oversee the initial stages that were on my slide previously of cell collection, cell banking, cell growth and differentiation for all of those products. But then USDA will oversee the further processing, pre-approve the labels, and verify through inspection. For the pre-market consultation process, FDA announced recently that it expects to issue industry guidance regarding that process, pre-market consultation process, this year in 2022. It's also stated that the process is going to include evaluating the production process and the produced biological materials, including tissue collection, cell lines, cell banks, manufacturing controls, and all the components and inputs. Evaluations of all of those will be part of the pre-market consultation process. And I should mention that some companies are already engaged in this process with FDA. And after a successful pre-market consultation process, FDA intends to conduct routine inspections on an ongoing basis, and other oversight at the cell banks and facilities where cells are cultured, differentiated and harvested to ensure that potential risks are being managed and that biological material exiting the culture is safe. So the agencies established working groups to address three key aspects of the regulatory scheme: the pre-market consultation process that I just talked about, the transfer of jurisdiction that will include at the harvest, that will take place at the harvest stage, and then also labeling. And since this formal agreement was entered into in 2019, both agencies have initiated public comment processes on the labeling issues separately, but they've expressed an intention to have to follow, the same principles in labeling. And I think we'll be talking about a little bit more about that in one of the later presentations. So this is just a little visual here of these are the, oh wait, hold on. Yes, this is the visual to just show the difference between the US system versus the other systems that I talked about, the novel food frameworks, where all of the stages of the process fall within the regulatory purview of a single agency. Here in the US, for the meat and poultry products, FDA is going to govern up to stage 4 and then transfer to USDA at stage 4. So just a reminder that these stages that I talked about earlier, those are the ones that will fall under FDA jurisdiction. Whereas USDA jurisdiction will cover the processing, packaging, and pre-market approval of labels for the meat and poultry, cultivated meat and poultry products. And then the last thing I'm going to mention are some international developments that occurred and are occurring on an ongoing basis. So the Codex Alimentarius is a set of voluntary international standards and guidelines for food safety and trade. And the Codex Alimentarius Commission is the corresponding international body of 189 global members who shape the standards. The CAC was established by the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization back in 1963. And it issues through a sort of dispersed committee process that rules by consensus-based process. It issues standards for various commodities as well as on horizontal issues like labeling. The standards, while voluntary, are influential because they can be the basis for national legislation. And they also serve as reference points in certain international trade agreements, which gives them a heightened legal meaning for the countries rather that are party to those agreements. So last year, prior to the annual meeting of the CAC, as it's called, FAO and WHO requested advice from CAC on how it could address issues relating to what it termed new food sources and production systems, or NFPS. And that category, this is sort of the beginning part of that document requesting that advice. That category is defined as including a number of alternative proteins, including cultivated meat. So at its meeting in November, the CAC determined that the Codex Secretariat would issue what's called a circular letter, which will seek information from member countries, as well as observer organizations. There are about 250 or so observer organizations to Codex. GFI is one of them. And those observers, while they cannot participate in voting on standards, for example, they can participate in processes like these of offering comments in response to this circular letter inquiry, which will ask countries and observers to share information on existing regulatory challenges and opportunities for the NFPS category, which the Codex Executive Committee will then consider and recommend a course of action for the CAC at its meeting in 2023. So this is an interesting development because it's the first time that Codex has taken up any kind of activity, particularly or potentially taken up any kind of activity relating to cultivated meat. It does raise the prospect of future standard or guidance on cultivated meat emerging at some point, though these processes do take a while, as I understand, through Codex because of the consensus system. So that's my overview of international perspective on regulatory frameworks for cultivated meat. And I'll turn it back to you, Dave.
Laura, thank you so much. If you wouldn't mind stop, yeah, there you go. And George, I believe you have some slides you want to share and you're up next.
Okay.
And for the audience, while George is loading that, feel free if you have questions that are on your mind because of the topic at hand, go ahead and load them up in the Q&A. We'll get to them later.
How's that? Can folks see my screen there?
You're not on presentation mode.
Okay, let me see if I can do that.
Hit those three dots, and then you should be able to switch to presentation. Yeah, three dots. Keep on going to the right. One more.
Shoot, not sure what I'm doing wrong. Can you see that?
Yes, there's a button down below by the scale button on the bottom right hand. That should be the presenter. One more over. That one should.
How's
Nope.
that?
No,
Let me try one more time. Hang on. Sorry about this.
no, you're good, George. It's a good time to load up those Q&As if the participants have them.
How about now?
It's
Perfect.
great.
All right. I've already shown my Luddite credentials, so we're off to a great start here. All right, I want to thank Pam Hart and George Foster and the Animal Law Program and the Business Law Program and the school at large for having the great symposium today and inviting us to be part of it, and David for his charge and his intro for us, and Laura for her excellent overview of both domestic and international legal standards. So I'm George Kimbrell. As David mentioned, in my day job, I'm the legal director for a U.S. nonprofit on sustainable agriculture, working on everything in the food system and striving towards a more regenerative future. And then I also teach, have taught for a while as an adjunct at the school, food and agriculture law over the years. So I'm very pleased to be with you all today. So my presentation, my overview today, if I can switch slides. Let's see. Okay, so I just wanted to clarify scope to start. Number one, I'm not going to be talking about any international stuff, so I'm glad Laura got us up to speed on all of that. I'm just going to be domestic. And then number two, I'm only going to be talking today narrowly about this, whatever we're going to call it. As she mentioned, it's got a bunch of different names, but essentially cell-cultured or cultured meats. So there's a lot of other great alternative sustainable proteins out there right now that you're seeing that are already proliferating in the marketplace based on soy, wheat. Obviously, we've had those for a long time. And then more recently, now you're seeing Impossible Burger, you're seeing Beyond Burgers, at your fast food restaurants and in your grocery stores and at Costco. Not talking about those, just really trying to focus and hone in on this newer technology of culture and meat. I think Laura has covered some of this, and so where there's overlap, I'll go fairly quickly and try to spend my time just focused on the areas where that are new. But essentially, this is, based, unlike those plant-based alternative proteins that you've heard about previously today from other panels, and then previously, this is animal meat, but it's coming from animal cells extracted from a living or recently dead animal. And then what they do with them has been explained, but essentially they're cultured in some type of a medium, like a fetal bovine serum or some other, to prepare the cultured meat. And then the trick with them essentially now to get them to scale up are these bioreactors, which we're going to talk about some in a little bit, and maybe how different they are than what we've done previously in our food system and challenges that they raise for food safety. And the idea is, look, we've got a destructive agricultural system right now. And so this is a way that we can produce meat that is going to cut out a lot of those harmful environmental impacts and animal impacts that we're seeing. So as I mentioned, nobody's sure what we're going to call this stuff yet. That's part of the big debate, right? I mean, as I'll get to, there are some stakeholders that just want to call it meat. They don't want any special nameage or standard of identity for it. But for the most part, there's been a lot of names that have been put out there. Cultured, cell-based, cultivated, lab-grown, clean meat are some of the ones that you have probably heard or will hear. There are lots of companies doing it for pork, chicken, beef, seafood, and lots of other things. And you probably haven't heard of a lot of these companies yet, since they're not at it's not in the grocery stores yet. But these are some of the bigger names that you don't know yet. You probably have heard, however, of some of the funders and some of the agricultural entities that are venture capitalists that are investing in the business. So it is getting to be big business, as we heard it earlier today in one of the panels. So just to go into a little more detail, so this is domestic oversight, and Laura again covered some of this, but essentially the short answer, if the question was posited today, is how are we going to regulate cultivated meat? I think the short answer is we don't know yet, but I'm going to tell you everything that we know and then everything that we don't know as best as I can. But basically, as Laura explained, so far FDA and USDA have agreed in a memorandum of understanding that they're going to split jurisdiction based on their various different existing statutory authorities, right? So we don't have a new congressional action or anything like that. This is just the agencies saying, FDA, I'm going to use my authority under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and USDA, I'm going to use my authority under the meat statutes, the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the Poultry Products Inspection Act, and we're going to regulate these the best we can using those authorities. FDA is going to take approximately the first half of the process, and USDA is going to kind of take the second half of the process. So FDA is going to oversee kind of these initial stages of production from cell collection to differentiation, and then USDA is going to regulate subsequent processing, packaging, and labeling for some of the products. Although, as was mentioned, FDA, and I'll talk about too, FDA has some of the jurisdiction for labeling because of the way we kind of split our food system oversight in a very Byzantine way. I mean, I think part of the problem and challenge for novel food regulation is that our food system itself has some lack of transparency, some gaps, and some unevenness. And it's hard for an expert to navigate, let alone a consumer in a store. And so when you layer on top of that a new technology, you're adding to that complication even further. So they've said they're going to do more on this, and there are some advanced notice of proposed rulemaking. That's what we have so far from the agencies. But I wanted to back up a step and just talk about food safety. As I alluded to, we have some, for some of us that do this work, we think it leaves a lot to be desired the way we regulate food safety in this country. But just generally, as applied to these cultured meats, the system that FDA will apply under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act essentially is their basic standard of safety, where you've got a couple of pathways. So you have food additives or color additives, or both of those things, and then you have substances that are generally recognized as safe. So food additives and color additives, essentially, the thing to remember is they require pre-market approval by FDA. So there has to be some kind of an agency action approving those before they can go out into the market and into the food system, into products to be consumed. The scope of that, and whether that's an adequate scope as far as what they're looking at can be debated, but at least there's this kind of transparent approval process. The GRAS system, generally recognized as safe, known as the acronym as GRAS, was always intended to kind of be an exception to that general rule of pre-market approval from the 1958 amendments to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the food additive amendments then. But what's happened is over the decade, it has become the loophole that has swallowed the rule. So now most new food ingredients that go into our food system go through the GRAS system, okay? And GRAS allows the manufacturer, number one, to self-determine whether that substance is generally recognized as safe or not. Maybe they have a consultation with FDA. If they do, it's confidential and it's voluntary. There's not any transparency to the public. Maybe they show FDA their studies or the summaries of their studies of the safety, but the determination of safety is made by the proprietary entity, which of course has a self-interest in that determination of safety. It's not made by the independent regulatory body. So the GAO, the Government Accountability Office in 2010 did a big report on this. This is not a new problem. We've had a problem with this GRAS system for a while as far as both conflicts of interest and kind of it being used as the major way that new food substances get into the food system. So now you look at it from the lens of novel food ingredients. And if past his prologue, I think a lot of these cultured meat ingredients are going to be determined to be GRAS. And the reason I say that is because I've seen that happen with prior new food technologies, genetically engineered ingredients, for example, nanomaterials, for another example. They're determined to be GRAS substances and allowed to go through that system without pre-market approval. So we'll see, but that's a really big determination. And if you look at a lot of the debate by the stakeholders in the advanced notice of public rulemaking that USDA and FDA are having, a lot of it is about whether or not these substances should be determined GRAS and have to have pre-market food safety approval by FDA. I should say that GRAS was intended to be something that was generally recognized by scientists universally to be safe. So it's similar to some of those international standards that Laura mentioned. And I think it's a really nice juxtaposition to look at those. Almost every one of those countries she mentioned has a novel food regulation for this type of an instance where they're going to look at it and they're going to say, okay, does this raise a different regulatory challenge for us, a unique regulatory challenge? Does it need different labeling? Does it need new toxicity testing, new types of data requirements? Whereas in the US, the assumption is the opposite. We're going to let it go to market without that type of an assessment for most of these cases. I would mention also the Food Safety Modernization Act, which is a sea change in the way we do food safety regulation, and amendment to the FFDCA in 2011. It does have some hazard analysis and risk-based preventions that I think will apply to these facilities, these bioreactor facilities, if and when this technology ever gets to commercial scale, although I think that's a big question that I have, whether it will get to commercial scale. And then at the bottom there, I have a few questions about food safety that I think people have raised as far as I mentioned, these bioreactors at a magnitude we've never seen before. Do they raise new concerns regarding sterility and biosecurity? What type of treatments do we use that can trigger different chemical reactions and create new carcinogenic or mutagenic risks and cancer-causing compounds? Or is there going to be contamination? I mean, if you think about it from the perspective of a dead animal that doesn't have an immune system to fight off the infection versus a live animal, I think you can understand that there might be some concerns as far as contamination of whatever the cell line sources are that end up getting used in the food, and why that might raise food safety concerns for some stakeholders. Okay, now into the nitty gritty of the particular agencies. I would say FDA, to break down the divide very quickly, FDA covers most of the food in the food system, about 80%, but only a small amount of the meat. Most of the meat is USDA, even though they only cover about 20% of the food system. That said, FDA does regulate some meat. I know it's clear as mud, right? They regulate, for example, almost all seafood except catfish. That's USDA. But they also have some meats under their jurisdiction known as exotic meats. That's like bison, pheasant, things like that. And then some egg products. So what FDA has done is they've come out with a public notice and comment on seafood products for the most part under their jurisdiction. And you'll see that these advanced notices of proposed rulemaking that the agencies have done, they're not proposing regulations yet. They're just kind of positing lots of questions. That's what these scoping notices generally do. And the questions are the same from both of the agencies, because I think it's right. They want to kind of be in a line, as their memorandum of understanding says. So, you know, the basic ones are, what should we call this stuff? Should it have a different name? And if so, what should it be? Does it need a new standard of identity? What attributes should we look at to determine whether it needs a new name and what it should be? What is material, in other words, to consumers? Now here, there's different precedent for FDA. With genetically engineered food, of course, there was a controversy for decades about their failure to label those foods, which eventually culminated in states labeling them, and then eventually a federal law being passed, a new federal law in 2016 requiring that labeling. But originally, from 1992 till 2016, FDA did not require that labeling. Of course, on the other hand, you have irradiated foods, which FDA has always labeled. So those are different material process-based changes in FDA's system and when they require labeling. And there I've listed a few comments or concerns looking in the docket, the FDA docket, a little bit this week. You know, as far as, okay, what should the naming be for this food? It should be not misleading. We need it to conform with USDA's naming. Should the market decide the name versus the agencies? Again, I mentioned pre-market approval and the grass loophole. Should it use genetically engineered cells? What does that mean for it? Are there different food safety handling risks, different nutritional differences? And then you'll see a big divide in both the industry and the public interest community here, which I'll talk about in my closing a little bit. But I think for the most part, it stems from the fact that if you're a group whose main mission is to stop one of the greatest moral tragedies of our time, which is the fact that we inhumanely treat and then kill 10 billion animals in confinement in these industrial animal agriculture animal factories every year, then you're looking for any way to try to end that system, and rightly so. On the other hand, if you're a consumer watchdog organization like, say, Consumer Union or Consumer Federation of America, maybe you're looking more at potential new health risks to people from this new technology and whether it's going to be properly analyzed before it's allowed into the market shelves. And the same thing with the different industries, right? Existing traditional industries are worried about being undercut here and whether this should have a new name. The new industry wants it to be called the same thing. They don't want to be singled out in some way because there's a big question about acceptance with regards, like with every new food technology. Similarly, on the USDA side, you know, they put out a scoping notice last year. I think the FDA notice is 2020. This one is September 2021. I will say one big difference in labeling is USDA requires kind of pre-market approval of labels, whereas FDA doesn't. FDA just does post-market enforcement of whether a label is false and misleading or not, does provide guidance. But you can see the questions posited there by USDA are very similar to FDA's questions as far as what should we call this stuff? Should it indicate that it's different than slaughtered meat? What terms should be allowed and what should be prohibited as far as used on it? So that can include like benefit types claims, like is this more humane or more green, things like that, that might process-based claims that might be included on a label. Do we need new regulations and what are the benefits and the costs to consumers and to the industry? Notice that in those dockets, what jumped out at me is there was only 35 comments on the regulations.gov docket for FDA. There's over 1,000 comments in the USDA docket. So you can see the greatly increased interest just right there. Questions about whether we have enough scientific information on cultured animal tissues to really set a standard of identity or to call it meat. Do we know enough about it that it's going to be the same thing? What would be misleading to consumers? To call it meat or not to call it meat? If we call it something like clean meat, is that impugning existing traditional sources in a way that, you know, would be misleading? And then, of course, as I said, some production concerns that have been raised as far as, is it really cruelty-free if you're using either animal cells from a dead or a live animal to create this fecal calf serum to grow the cells, and lots of new forms of genetic engineering that may be used in it. And there has been some congressional action to try to codify what the agencies have done by Senator Tester from Montana, a few others that haven't gone anywhere yet. I did want to say before closing, one example that jumped out at me as I was kind of preparing to give this is an issue I've worked on for a while, genetically engineered animals. Of course, this was an area, you know, that we've been kind of waiting on research and development for 20, 25 years now, where you had FDA starting the process in 2000 there. In 2009, they finally set kind of a regulatory pathway for genetically engineered animal food. With a guidance document. They didn't amend their regulations, so no new law, just kind of soft law guidances. And then they didn't approve the first genetically engineered animal for food until 2015, a genetically engineered salmon. What's interesting is that it's not regulated as a food substance, but rather as a drug under FDA's authority, because it's a substance that falls under that broad definition of drug in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, that it is intended to affect the structure of animals. and labeling is required for it. And there has been some litigation that in which I was involved that culminated last year with the court holding that that approval was unlawful and violated several core environmental laws. Mostly because, again, there was a difference between kind of what was said to be the intent of that particular substance and kind of the reality of it, which is that it created quite a few significant environmental risks rather than kind of solving the problem that it sought out to solve, which was the harm of industrial aquaculture and overfishing. All right. So in closing, I would just say, for me, having worked on these issues for almost 2 decades now, past is prologue. You know, I think cell-cultured foods seem a really promising alternative right now to a really damaging food system that is causing a tremendous amount of harm, as I said, to the environment, to animals. It's a major factor in climate change. But this is not my first rodeo when it comes to new food technologies. And what I have seen over the years is that there is a chasm between the hype and the reality of what the commercial reality of what they end up being over and over and over again. And I've also seen that public good uses tend to fall by the wayside, and private uses tend to be the market-driven outcomes that rise to the top. You can see that with genetically engineered crops pretty easily, right? They haven't helped us feed the world or fight climate change or even increase yields. Instead, they are overwhelmingly engineered to be resistant to pesticides, and they're produced by chemical companies whose flagship products are those pesticides. With labeling, what I've seen is that the failure to label new novel technologies has led to consumer mistrust and rejection. So I think, you know, this particular one would learn a smart lesson from those past technologies and lean into their own labeling and be proud of what they are. And beyond that, I think philosophically, the approach that we have to these new technologies is important to recognize that, again, these quick fix technological panaceas sometimes can overshadow and seem the easier route than undertaking the difficult systemic paradigmic change that needs to happen in order to have a regenerative food system. So in other words, maybe the solution isn't necessarily looking for the next shiny technology to fix it, but instead to actually do the hard work, stop subsidizing industrial agriculture and, you know, all the crops that we do in the Farm Bill every 4 years that are the only pillars that allow kind of the very unsustainable industrial system that we have right now. And finally, that anytime you introduce new technology, there's almost always kind of new problems that arise from it that were unforeseen, new risks to the environment and health that come from it. So with that, I'll stop, and thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Mathilde, I'd like to invite you to present your topic.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. And I would like to talk about a very specific sustainable protein, which I call lab-grown human milk. So you may be asking, why lab-produced human milk? For whom? Human milk, as you know, is typically produced by human parents by their mammary glands to feed their babies. And for millennia, the only alternative to maternal breastfeeding was wet nursing, that is, the nursing of a baby by someone who's not their parents. So this is, you know, I'm originally from France. This is Louis XVI and one of his wet nurses. And it was not until the 19th century that animal milk, particularly cow's milk, was increasingly seen as a viable alternative when pediatricians, scientists, and industry players began to modify animal milk to create what's called now a formula. So today, about 60% of infants younger than 6 months are not exclusively breastfed, yet human milk is the gold standard for infant nutrition. It benefits all infants, but particularly the most sick and premature babies. We have an entire sector dedicated to human milk sharing, which is the idea that people with excess milk will donate for other families in need, but it's still in the United States not used in all hospitals, hard to obtain on an outpatient basis, and not always covered by insurance. So there's clearly a market for substitutes to human milk, and given the inadequacies of the existing infant formula, there's now a new movement to create so-called lab-grown milk, human milk products. So these are products that are being developed by mostly female-led startup biotech companies using different techniques, including culturing mammary cells or yeast in bioreactors to secrete analogs of human milk components. So there are different products that are envisioned. Some would be just universal infant formula for all babies. Other are more specific. It would be, for example, personalized human milk based on a given parent's own mammary cells, or a product, say, for premature infants or infants with some medical conditions. And as with the other products, as my co-panelists have shared, there's a lot of uncertainty as to what the adequate terminology is. So I picked lab-grown, lab-produced human milk because I feel it's the most descriptive. But there are all these other labels that are being used. So what is innovative about lab-produced human milk in particular? So what companies that are making or trying to make it claim is that it would be nutritionally identical to human milk, which infant formula isn't, and it would be therefore much more beneficial for infants, more digestible, and in the long run, it could include bioactive factors that are typically absent from traditional formula. Here, though, I want to highlight the difference with the rest of cell-cultured agriculture, because most of the other products we've talked about so far are trying to replicate something that's already found in nature, whereas here, I would say that lab-produced human milk is a substitute for a substitute, in the sense that at least the current companies are positioning it as not trying to supplant lactation and human milk from humans, which everybody agrees is the most sustainable and beneficial way to feed humans. But as a way, they're claiming that they will replace infant formula, which is already a substitute. That said, this product raises a number of social and legal questions, in particular, the impact of these new products on, or the potential impact on lactation and infant feeding choices, and the stakes on regulation. So I'll focus on these 2 points. First, talk about the pros and cons of these new products before talking about potential regulatory pathways. So what are the pros and cons? Some arguments track the rest of cellular agriculture, while some are specific to these products. So in terms of ethics, the lab-produced human milk is sometimes presented as having a positive impact on animal welfare and the environment when compared to infant formula. But when you compare it to human milk produced by humans, human milk produced by humans, as I mentioned before, is far more sustainable than any substitute, and is far more ethical, as it doesn't require the exploitation of animals. In terms of health and safety, people point out that the hope is that these products would allow greater control over input, so they would be free, say, from pesticides, growth hormones, and antibiotic residues that you find in animal milk, and they would have a nutritional and compositional profile that's closer to human milk. But as George noted, there's a lot of uncertainty as to what the risk would be in manufacturing them. and combining all these different elements. And also they rely on a very narrow vision of what human milk is, you know, as a mix of various components, when human milk is arguably a relation. It's a relation between an adult and an infant, and human milk evolves every day, every hour, from the beginning to the end of a feed, to be adapted to a particular baby. It also is an effective relationship. So all these things would be lost in a substitute. Other aspects of these pros and cons are the economy. So if these products could potentially become cost effective, but one question is are they the best use of resources? Shouldn't we focus our resources on, for example, allowing people to share human milk? Or is there a risk, just like George was mentioning, of a few companies controlling the infant formula of the future? And finally, there's a series of social questions. So is the product good in the sense that it would alleviate the feeling of shame that some families feel because they have to resort to infant formula? Or, but on the other hand, could it lead to even more infant formula consumption and distract from the urgency of actually supporting lactation? So to summarize, I would say that if it fulfilled its promises, lab-produced milk would certainly be far better than conventional infant formula, but it would have the risk of distracting us from the urgency, which I think is to support lactation and human milk sharing. In terms of regulation, so there's no standard of identity for human milk, so let alone for lab-produced human milk. And the sort of emerging framework for cultivated meat that my co-panelists talked about will probably not apply, or at least not as is, to these products, which are primarily designated for infants and thus subject to a more exacting type of regulation in light of the specific risks for an infant population. For infants until the age of 6 months only consume infant formula, and they consume enormous quantities relative to their weight. So there are a lot more risks in what these types of products contain. But other products might be imaginable based on lab-grown human milk in the future for older infants, but also cosmetics, supplements for adults. Maybe they could even become ingredients added in foods for adults or drinks for adults. So you can imagine a variety of existing legal frameworks applying, from the most stringent, which would be drug or biologic, to the most lenient, which would be food. And within food, these products could be regulated as additives, as grass, as George was talking about, or also as infant formula, because infant formula is currently considered a subcategory of food, but subject to a higher scrutiny. And here, the one issue I would flag is that for infant formula, FDA requires trials, which is good on the one hand, but on the other hand, it raises ethical questions, because everybody knows that human milk is the gold standard for infants. So how do you build a trial that is ethical, in that you're going to actually test a substitute to human milk? That raises questions, and where are you going to conduct it, etc. So what is the path forward? Should regulators apply the existing framework, or should they come up with a new framework? If so, which framework? What should this framework look like? Should it be part of other novel foods, or should it be specific to the case of human milk analogs? I'm not going to answer this question, but what I would say is I think this is the opportunity for American regulatory agencies to strengthen their existing infant regulation, infant food regulation, in particular infant formula. I think the current framework is not strict enough, and we need a lot more oversight. I also think that we need a lot more publicly funded research in this area, and public monies to be invested in the commons of human milk components so they don't risk being monopolized by a few companies. To conclude, I would say that also the fact that there's a potential market for these products should really alert us to the fact that our culture doesn't really give the chance to most parents to lactate and feed their infants with their own milk. And to me, this is a fundamental problem and the regulatory urgency. We need work, health, and insurance laws that allow people to actually nurse their own babies and donate extra for people who can't. So we need things. I know this might sound very far from FDA, USDA, because it is. We need things like paid parental leave, high quality and affordable healthcare, including lactation care, flexible work arrangements, paid lactation leaves, and a lot more. So to me, this is really the urgency, but I'm also realistic, and I know that probably this is not where we're heading. So the second best would be a much stricter regulatory framework for infant formula, including lab-produced human milk. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions and feedback.
Mathilde, thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists for those awesome presentations. We do have a Q&A that's from the audience that I'll get to in a second, but I want to ask all of you, you think about the topics that we've covered today and have been covered all day, and we're all grappling for what do you call it? And so to make any kind of business endeavor profitable over time, the consumer has to accept it. And I wonder if you could each say something about, your thoughts on consumer acceptance of whether it's cultured meat or a lab produced formula, and where do we go with that? And what do you think the struggles are going to be for the companies in this space? Maybe we'll start in order. Laura, do you want to maybe tackle that one first in the order that we presented?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. I do think consumer acceptance is a huge issue and something that everyone is thinking about in the industry and on the sidelines. And effective communication is an important part of that. Certainly not the only part, but an important part. And I think, it's a little tricky because we don't know in terms of terminology and what is selected. We don't really know yet how consumers are going to understand different terms. So, for us at GFI, we're a little wary of government imposing specific terms right now when it's not clear how that will be understood by consumers, because these products just aren't available yet in the marketplace. But I would say too that I think that's part of what's motivating some of the different views that George was talking about expressed on this issue is not so much any difference in whether groups want consumers to understand what the products are. I think everybody does. I mean, it's part of the value proposition of the products for the industry is that they are made in this different way that is more beneficial for the planet and for animals. But there are some different ideas as to how that's best achieved. But even going beyond labeling, I would also say that I think, consumer education about the process and some of the risks and how they're mitigated is really important. I think that there can be some fear around a new process that people aren't familiar with. And I think that having an understanding of, it's a complicated thing, but having some understanding of how it works and how risks are being mitigated is important. I think that I think the process that FDA is putting into place actually should give people confidence. It is they're going to be reviewing in the pre-market consultation process, which is not voluntary. So just there's not a possibility here that a company is going to put cultivated meat on the market without going through FDA. And it's examining the process as well as the output. And I think, to George's point about it not being his first rodeo with new foods and new technologies, it's not FDA's first rodeo either. And partly because of that, I expect that there will be transparency when products start to get approved from the FDA, and that hopefully that will go a ways towards building consumer confidence as well.
Thanks, Laura. George, what's your take on this issue?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll have to respectfully disagree with my esteemed colleague with some of her closing remarks there. I mean, look, it may not be voluntary now, but if they make it grass, it will become voluntary, because I know for a fact that the grass system is a voluntary system. We just litigated it in the Southern District of New York and lost a case challenging the fact that it was voluntary. So the courts have upheld that it can be voluntary. So FDA has yet to determine, maybe right now they're saying it's not, but if they give it grass status, it becomes a self-determination and becomes voluntary. And my own reflections on how FDA has done so far has been that it has an abysmal track record with both transparency as well as food safety when it comes to new and emerging technologies. So again, I think my remarks about this past being prologue is that advocates for cell-based systems need to learn from mistakes of prior advocates for prior new technologies and not make the same ones. And those mistakes being a lack of transparency with consumers, a lack of labeling, and a lack of rigorous oversight with the agencies, instead trying to go through the loopholes at both USDA and at FDA. So to answer your question, David, I think that they should call it cell-based or lab-based, something like that. But if you look at a lot of the comments in the dockets, which I did this week, a lot of the advocates in favor of it just want it to be called meat, or as little as possible as far as what they want it to be called. So I don't know necessarily that they have learned those lessons. I think calling it what it is, whatever we're going to call it, I think cultured is a little confusing, because you have yogurt, you have some other different cultured processes in which that could be confused. I mean, the basic legal standards are, it shouldn't be false and misleading to consumers, either expressly or by omission, right? And so it's kind of a reasonable person standard, which all of us in the law should be familiar with. What would be false and misleading consumers? And we had a whole panel on kind of the plant-based alternatives and some of the state litigation that's ongoing under the First Amendment earlier today, which was excellent, that dealt with some of those topics as well. So I think that's the standard that should guide, and hopefully will guide, what it ends up being called.
Thanks, George. And Mathilde, what's your take on consumer acceptance of what can be kind of a controversial topic?
So I think there's much less of a problem. I mean, there are no empirical studies, but my hunch is that there would be much less of a difficulty for consumers to accept lab-produced human milk, because those are likely to be the same people who are currently buying infant formula, and infant formula is already lab-produced, right? It's just a less high-tech and less sophisticated mode of production. So because we're talking here about, again, a substitute of a substitute rather than a substitute of, a living fluid, I think it's like right now you buy a powder that's made in a lab, and if you want, there'll be infant formula 2.0, it will be lab produced human milk, and it'll be powder or a fluid. Or so I think there's less of a problem in terms of consumer acceptance, and in terms of labeling, I don't have any specific recommendation other than that it follow the rules, that it not be misleading, and that consumers are aware that this is not actually donor human milk, which is something completely different, but lab produced human milk.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to turn to one of the questions from the audience, and that is, how effective are less invasive ways to collect cells for lab-grown meat, for example, by getting cells from an already fallen feather instead of drawing blood from an animal? If I could start the answer on that one, I think we've done that with a feather. If I'm not mistaken, we have a company, Just Eat maybe, or Eat Just, that has used a chicken feather for cell-based chicken meat. But does anyone want to talk about, the actual extraction of the cells or different things that companies or scientists are exploring, and how that might interface with slaughter or whole animal or not?
Speaking for myself, unfortunately, I don't have expertise on that particular question of sort of the comparative difficulties or not with collecting cells in different ways. I know that there are different ways, and as you said, there are non-invasive ways, but I can't speak to sort of the comparative advantages or disadvantages. Sorry.
Yeah, same for me, David. I mean, I think one of the major questions is the scale issue and getting to commercial scale, and the issue of the bioreactors. And so I think that question, the broader, for me, reframe I would posit is, okay, what are the potential advantages and risks of a system of production that would be new and in that manner, essentially. Which again, I won't proclaim to be a scientist or an expert in either, other than the fact that I think that it's recognized that they raise new types of risks, food safety risks.
Okay, great. Audience, keep the Q&A coming. We really want to hear what's on your mind. So we spend a lot of time, I'm a food safety researcher at heart. And so we spend a lot of time talking about risk and, the idea of, absolute risk or relative risk of a new technology versus no technology. But I'd love to hear from each one of you what you are most excited, maybe on the benefit side of what you're respectively talking about. Like if these technologies get adopted, what are you most excited about that this could present for society?
I'm happy to go first on that if no one else wants to jump in, but I think it has tremendously exciting potential to combat a number of societal ills, not only the negative climate impacts that we've talked about of commercial industrial agriculture, but also issues relating to antibiotic resistance. I think George raises concerns about bioreactors and getting them up to scale. And I do think there are questions there about how that's going to work and how risks are going to be mitigated. But at the same time, it is a contained environment. There's a tremendous amount of risk of infection among animals that are raised for slaughter because of the conditions that they're raised in. And that's why so much prophylactic antibiotic use takes place in that industry. So, I think with bioreactors, there's not a need to use antibiotics because we can build on technologies that have been used in other sectors in other biomanufacturing industries. So for example, manufacturing biologic drugs or vaccines, those are products with a huge, much higher price point than is going to be, necessary for cultivated meat to make it in the marketplace. But because of that, they worked really hard to develop strong protections against contamination so that they wouldn't have to trash a bunch of product that had been cultured. And so some of those sterilization techniques and use of filtration membranes, I think are adaptable to cultivated meat production and, can give some confidence to mitigation of risks like infection risk and contamination risk that you don't always have when dealing with traditional agriculture.
Laura, I'll add to that. When you mentioned the antibiotic resistance, I immediately thought too of the epidemiological surveillance we have to do for avian flu with some of the current flocks, and whether that would be a bonus to mitigate that issue as well. George, were you going to add in on there?
Yeah, I mean, look, as I said, I think arguably the greatest moral failing of our time is the fact that we have 10 billion animals in confinement and we slaughter them every year in the industrial agriculture system. Um, and then, I think it would be hard pressed to find a greater and more important environmental imperative than addressing the urgent climate crisis and the methane and other aspects of that come from the industrial agriculture system. So I totally support efforts to try to, my whole job and my vocation is focused on trying to stop those harms. My concern is only, as I mentioned, that, to me, I think it's very similar to, I think efforts to geoengineering, for example. So it's like, well, instead of kind of halting climate emissions, we should engineer the weather to better stop the effects of climate change. It's not an either or situation, but the more focus we have on a technological panacea, the less there is on reforming what needs to be reformed, which is an unsustainable agricultural system that we have. And I think when you do kind of look for that type of a solution, invariably, history teaches us over and over again, we introduce new and unforeseen risks. So right now, this technology looks great. I don't see a lot of environmental risks from it. I wonder where the toxins might go from the bioreactors that they're going to have, the kind of big vats to create this stuff. But I don't know a lot about it. It's all still kind of science fiction-y. But my history teaches me that there will be some risks that come from it. And whatever energies we're putting into it are energies that are not going into dismantling the current destructive system, which in my view is where we need to be focusing our energy.
Yeah, and so I echo George here, but I would like to emphasize that I know as the literature on sustainable protein shows, many of the benefits are still promissory. So there's a lot of, there's a lot of hope, lots of expectation, but we actually don't know whether those will pan out in reality. So clearly, if lab produced human milk becomes the infant formula of the future, it sounds like a much better alternative than traditional infant formula, which is made mostly out of commodity crops and animal milks raised in conditions of complete horror. And it would also be a better product nutritionally and immunologically for infants, which is a difference with sustainable protein for adults, because I don't think the claim is being made as much that, cultivated meat would be much better for you than flesh from animals, whereas it seems that lab-produced human milk would actually be much better for babies than conventional infant formula if the promises are met. But then there are all these things we're not talking about, which is, why not focus on, again, helping humans lactate and produce extra human milk? Because there are lots of risks that are yet unforeseen in terms of how will these components interact together, what will they do to babies, etc. In addition to all these inputs that will continue to, where will the inputs to the bioreactors come from? How will they be grown? There are energy costs, there are packaging costs, there are transporting costs. Whereas if you think about lactation, especially in milk sharing, when it's body to body, there's none of that. You don't have to stock, you don't have to refrigerate it, you don't have to transport. So that would be the most sustainable and cruelty-free infant feeding method.
Thank you, Mathilde. A couple of questions have dropped in. Laura, this one might be more germane to you, given that you covered how some different countries regulate. And that is, what do international trade agreements have or lack to allow the imports, exports of these technologies? Or have international trade agreements even begun to address these technologies?
Yeah, I'm not aware that they have. So I'm not expert enough in the field of international trade to know, the exact effects of that in terms of what, imports or exports are then allowable. But I'm not aware of any trade agreements that have taken
Laura, while I have you on the hot seat, out of the countries that you overviewed, is there a system in place that you think is more robust than the others?
I think that I haven't thought about it in quite that way. What we're usually looking for when we're evaluating different regulatory structures is, are they, clear, and are they imposing sort of unfair hurdles or hurdles that wouldn't be faced, by other food products, and there isn't a reason for them to be faced. So, we've supported the U.S. regulatory structure. It's not necessarily what I would design if I was designing it from scratch, but at the same time, we don't think that there is a need to redesign the structure, and that existing structures can be used here to safely and adequately evaluate and regulate the products. So we do support the U.S. framework, and as I alluded to earlier, think that the steps that FDA is taking in the pre-market consultation process do appear robust, and I expect for more information on that to become publicly available soon.
Great. Here's another question that's come in, and I know this is a lot on the minds of the economists. How can lab-grown meat be made more affordable for consumers? So we've seen the price point come down from I think it was Masa Meats, maybe, that had the first astronomically high hamburger, right? So we've seen those numbers plummet, just like we have in the plant-based space. How do we reach that tipping point with traditional agriculture? Is it more research needed? Is it scaling? What is the panel's take on that?
I think it's a combination of both those things. I do think that there are areas where more research and development is needed, and particularly as it relates to scaling. So, some of the equipment costs are pretty high right now, and I think that there will need to be some technological solutions to that, and also some improvements to the productivity of the process. So I think that real cost competitiveness for cultivated meat is a ways off. We at GFI commissioned a technical and economic analysis last year that predicted, based on the assumptions used, that cost competitiveness for most traditional meats could be achieved by 2030. So that's the prediction that we saw in that report.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So for the panel, as we're kind of running out of time here, but I wonder if I could hear from all three of you. I'm a scientist, I'm not a lawyer. Beyond labeling, because we know the labeling issue is already in litigation, what do you think are the things about these topics that are going to be low-hanging fruit for lawsuits in litigation? Was that an unfair Friday afternoon stumper?
Oh, I was waiting for my esteemed panelists, if anybody wanted to go first. I think, David, I'm an administrative lawyer, so my bailiwick is going to be more in the realm of agency action. So that's why I was kind of digging into what the agencies are doing. I'm very comfortable in that space. We'll see what they do. My guesses are that there won't be new regulations. They'll do a lot of soft law guidances. Laura mentioned FDA has already indicated they're going to come out with the guidance later this year. If they do that, if there's not a lot of administrative law changes to address the new technology, then you would see kind of the action move to state law-based Consumer Protection Act litigation, kind of similar to what the panelists at 1:30 were discussing with the plant-based substances. And that could be very similar, where you have either states enacting laws saying you can't call it this or you must call it that, and challenges from industry, or vice versa, kind of class action cases saying the failure to label this is false and misleading. Or so I think you see plenty of action kind of in the labeling realm. But beyond that, it really is going to determine, based on what happens as far as with the technology, how fast it comes to market, whether they can scale it up and make it, as the commentee was positing, commercially viable or not. I think it's all to be determined, and what the impacts of that scaling are. I mean, a lot of times with the technology, the impacts at one scale are not concerning or environmentally destructive, yet when you scale it up to an industrial scale, they then become, cumulatively speaking, more of a problem. So, I think some other litigation with regards to externalization of costs potentially in that realm could also be in the cards, depending on how that goes.
Thanks, George. Mathilde, Laura, any other quick thoughts before we turn it back over to George Foster?
All right. Well, thank you all so much. And that was, I think, a terrific way to end a day of panels that have all been very substantive and engaging, and have covered this issue of sustainable protein from so many different angles. So we've reached the end of those panel discussions, and I just wanted to offer some very brief closing reflections. I'm mindful it's a Friday and we're late in the day, so I'm not going to keep people long. I just want to say I really enjoyed sitting through all these conversations today, and I couldn't help but come away with the feeling that we are on the cusp of something monumental in terms of how our society eats. We've already had so many innovations, others that are in the works, and the human diet is already in the process of being transformed. That's clear, and I think we certainly have reason to believe that much more is to come, especially with some of these more exotic products that are being developed that were the subject of panels 2 and 4. And in fact, because of those, we may not be too far off from a time in the future when people who would never consider themselves as somebody who would become a vegan or a vegetarian will have diets that are entirely slaughter-free. And just a few years ago, that would have sounded like a paradox. So now we have seen, as was explored in some depth in the last panel, that there are still significant technological hurdles for some of these products, especially when it comes to scaling up to mass production. And there are also regulatory hurdles. There are concerns about food safety and making sure the food is healthy. And we don't have right now a regulatory framework that's really fully developed, that's in the process. And the law is going to have to evolve to keep pace with these innovations. But I would venture to say that given with so much we have at stake environmentally, ethically, as well as so much money to be made from all of this, it seems likely that those hurdles are going to be overcome eventually. So that having been said, I think it is worth pointing out some issues, some lingering uncertainties that we really didn't have time to get into in this conference, but I think are very important, and perhaps this could be the subject of a future conference. In particular, much of our discussion had to do with these really cutting edge products like cultured or cultivated meat and fish and milk and so on. And so I mentioned in my opening remarks that it's sort of an open question whether these truly deserve to be called sustainable. So it'll certainly be slaughter free, and that's certainly a benefit, but will it be manufactured in a way that is efficient in terms of its use of energy and other resources? What sort of emissions will be associated with these products once all of the manufacturing processes and distribution is in place? Also, in terms of other dimensions of sustainability, one question that was raised actually from one of the audience members is, to what extent will these products be broadly accessible to the public? And I mean internationally, will these products be widely enough available to all countries, not just the most affluent ones, and also not just the elite within the most affluent countries, because only if they were broadly available would we really be able to have a transformation in the human diet. And I guess that question goes not just to cultivated meat, but all these other forms of sustainable protein that are have been developed in recent years through advanced technology. Another question in terms of sustainability is, will the workers, once all these manufacturing processes are worked out, will the workers making these products be paid a living wage? Or will companies, once they overcome all these technological and regulatory hurdles, decide to site their production in the places where there's the lowest price labor and the lowest labor standards? So that's something I think may remain to be seen. Now, it could be, and I'm optimistic, would like to believe that that these amazing technologies we've been hearing so much about will actually be lead to local, well-paid jobs, which could benefit communities that have lost so much manufacturing in recent decades, while at the same time avoiding the need for long-distance transport of the end product and all the environmental impacts associated with it. So, I would just flag that I think these are some open issues about sustainability, but I would certainly like to think that these products could be quite sustainable, and certainly much more so than our existing food system. So all in all, I would say, despite these unanswered questions, sustainable protein in all its forms gives us many reasons to be optimistic. And I would say that in troubled times, such as we're living through now, we have to take every chance we have to be optimistic. So I would like to thank you all for coming, for joining us for our conference today. And I also would like to just offer a few words of thanks. Thanks to everyone who served on a panel today or moderated. We all benefited greatly from your insights and your diligence in preparing. I'd also like to thank Dean Jennifer Johnson of our law school for the idea of animal law and the business law program, looking for new ways to collaborate. And that sort of planted a seed and got us thinking and led us eventually to this topic, which I think proved quite fruitful. Also would like to thank everyone at the Center for Animal Law Studies and Center for Business Law and Innovation who were involved in planning and logistical support. That would include Megan Senatori, Richard Adams, Rachel Flaherty, also everyone involved with Events AV, who handled the audiovisual aspects of the webinar, including Henry Van Buren and his team, and all the staff members who helped promote the event, and students as well. So again, thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful evening and weekend.